Welcome to the EpicureanFriends.com book review of A Few Days in Athens, a story about Epicurus and Epicurean philosophy. Please keep in mind that A Few Days in Athens is fictional, and the author is giving you her own interpretation of Epicurus. In a few cases, she deviates from Epicurus's own views fairly dramatically, but when we get to those, we'll point them out to you clearly. Even more, keep in mind that the participants you're about to hear are giving their own opinions. There are many different interpretations of Epicurus, and we hope this book review will prompt you to study Epicurus for yourself. For those who want to read more about Epicurus, the book we recommend the most is Norman DeWitt's Epicurus and His Philosophy. We also invite you to join us for discussion at the EpicureanFriends.com forum and to listen to our companion podcast, Lucretius Today, which is available at all major podcast sources. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll enjoy this session, so let's join it now.
Well, the thing to keep in mind, too, is that I did not watch the video from last time, so I have no idea what was talked about.
Kevin had he was really interested in that scene. And I remember one of the things he was talking about was he was commenting on how maybe Metrodorus was trying to draw her as a younger girl who was trying to emphasize sexuality maybe, but that she was really older than that, and somehow he was not appreciating that or something. So Kevin was looking at it as potentially some kind of a comment about hedonism, but I don't really know that. I didn't find any of the things we discussed as particularly satisfactory. Like I said, there's the obvious point about Epicurus saying that the wise man is not going to oppose poetry, but a good critic of it. And that probably has some application to going on. But it really did seem like a more extended story than really would have justified that. So now that I've thought about her recently, there's a comment, maybe in Diogenes Laertius, that maybe there's no real statement that she was the girlfriend of anybody really. But maybe there's the implication that she was like Metrodorus's girlfriend, and I think I saw some statement to the fact that Epicurus liked her too, or something like that.
Yeah, I don't think it was girlfriend though. I mean, it was what courtesan or something like that.
Courtesan's a good word.
Hatarai. She was in Hatarai.
And of course, when you throw out a Greek word like that, and you're the man to define it.
I mean, I think the Hatarai were simply the translation is courtesan or something like that. But it was like, but they were women who at least had a little bit more freedom because they basically, set their own limits and that sort of thing. But we're also expected to be able to talk about poetry and have conversation. And they were the ones that were at the symposium and would play the men off of each other to try and get the best. I say the best deal for themselves, but they were definitely. I mean, they had to make as much money as they could, whenever they were younger, and a lot of them, set themselves up so they had, independently wealthy and that sort of thing. And one of them, I can't remember, was the one who supposedly rebuilt the walls of one of the cities or something like that. That she had enough money that she was able to, rebuild the walls after the city walls had been destroyed and this kind of thing. And so it was one of the few areas that women could really be independent in ancient Greece. I mean, but there was still such a tenuous situation too, because there was no legal protections and things like that. So, but that was why those women were able to come to the garden and that sort of thing, from what I understand, because the wives were basically locked up in the houses and not allowed to leave, and were under lock and key and all that sort of thing. So,
okay, well, Godfrey is back. So, Joshua,
right? So basically, the way I sort of understand this extended consideration of the arts in chapter is, I think, probably twofold. When we get to not chapter 4, which Don read, but I think maybe chapter 5 or 6, we're going to spend, I think, the entire chapter, actually 2 chapters, in the Stoa, in the portico. And so one of the things that I think is going on here is Frances Wright is beginning to establish a contrast, sort of day to day, as she imagined the garden, versus this sort of almost religious fervor for virtue and for expunging apostasy that you're going to find Zeno portico. Whether that's a reflection of reality at the time, I don't know. But that is the way she's going to portray Zeno and then Stoicism and the portico at that time. In chapter 4, which Don did read, we do have a contrast between the Epicurus Cynics already. Is that right, Don? You read it.
Right. That is correct.
There you go.
Is that when they get Gryphon in?
Yes. So Yeah, it's one thing to sort of establish philosophical principles, do that kind of thing, but I think it's partially that contra, the day-to-day acting. And the reason that's important is because, of course, all the other philosophers in Athens think that what's going on in the garden are these horrible, dreadful nighttime orgies.
Gluttony and throwing up after the feast.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, you see paintings from, I guess maybe from the Renaissance. I don't know. I can't think of the name of one offhand, but it'll be like a guy laying back in bed with a laurel wreath on his head, and there's a whole banquet laid out around him,
Right.
and a whole bunch of people, and that's the picture that people imagine. So to have the kind of thing that was describing in chapter 3, not only does it look favorable compared with what's going on in Zeno's school, it looks favorable, very favorable compared to what everyone else thinks is going on in the garden. And then there's the more meta level analysis of, when you have in your audience someone like Thomas Jefferson, as Frances Wright did, there's a certain zest for classical art. At this time, she was writing it about the height of the Enlightenment, or maybe on the tail end of it, and not going into the Victorian age. So the idea that classical harmonies of statuary and poetry are worth pursuing is something that her audience would not have been told. This is the time that you have people digging up old statues and putting them on display in their home. I think that it presents the garden favorably. I think that's probably one reason. I know that's not a very good philosophical explanation for why she's doing this in chapter 3, but I think that's part of it.
Joshua, what about the blooming aspect of it? Because that's a significant part of their interaction, is that Metrodorus senses that he's done something wrong in the painting and capturing her, and Epicurus describes it, or maybe I can't remember whether Epicurus uses the word blooming, or he comes up with it, or she comes up with it, or whatever. But anything there that you saw as significant as to the error he was making and blooming thing meant?
Yeah, in fact, they almost immediately say what the error was. Leontium, in the view, I think it was Epicurus, in his view, should have been displayed as being more mental and less. Blooming is a word I don't often use to describe people,
No.
but the idea was there that what she was bringing to the table here was she really had a great mind, a pen that was praised by Cicero, and so
I got the same vibe. I couldn't. Yeah, I was really feeling that too, because otherwise you're just turning her into a stereotype. Oh, you're a woman, so I'm going to make you beautiful. That's all you are. But they didn't detract from that beauty. But Epicurus simply said, just put a little streak of gray here and there. Just give her also wisdom a little bit. Represent that, So
right.
I'm hearing you.
One of the more interesting books I've read in the last few years, which I brought up, I think time and again, you might be tired of hearing it, is, oh God, now I get the title. Don, you read it.
Is that the Alexandria one?
Yes. Yeah, The Rise and Fall of Alexandria.
Yeah.
There is an interesting section in that book, I think, on Cleopatra. And that's the connection I draw here between Leontium and Cleopatra. Mm-hmm. Cleopatra is known to history, ravishingly beautiful, but the sources suggest that that's not the case. She was alluring because she was brilliant, and she could talk about. She was raised by the Ptolemies in the city more than any other that valued for its own sake.
Yeah.
And so she could discourse on any subject that was raised. And I think it's that more than, I say, mere beauty that was a big part of her appeal. And I think it's the same for Leontium.
Yeah, the fact that Cicero even says what a good writer Leontium was, that grudgingly, I'm sure. I mean that just goes to show, I think, the level of her brilliance as well, because I mean, of course, we're going to burn the books that she wrote, but and we're going to have any trace of that. But to even deign to say, oh, this woman wrote something against Theophrastus, and it actually held up, and we were shocked. We had the vapors about how good it was.
That's right. In fact, Cicero, I don't know which book it is, or it's in one of his letters. He talks about the earliest Epicurean Italy. What were their names? Amaphinius or something, and this other guy.
Catius. Wasn't Catius and Rufinus?
Rufinus. You might be right about that. Anyway, he's talking about these two. He gives them credit for being the only people at the time who were willing to write in the vernacular, which I think that alone says something about Epicurean philosophy and the way the school itself. to the people it was trying to convince. This is not a philosophy stricted to the elites, but we could even translate this into the vulgar Latin, and these poor people can read our books. But what he says about them is, even though they were almost the first to write in Latin on philosophy, their prose was terrible, according to this row. He had very, very high when it came to style. And so for him to say what he said about Leontium, he said she wrote elegantly in good Attic. I mean, that is the highest compliment of which Cicero is capable.
Yeah.
Does that answer the question? I don't know that I have a whole lot more to say.
It does, Joshua. Do you, I think what we probably ought to, I mean, you may have some other commentary generally about the rest of chapter 3 that we want to be sure to include, but I'm thinking that I specifically, since I'm a good Ciceronian, semi-stoic, and I have a duty to fulfill my obligations, I have a duty to let, I specifically told Scott last week to hold his thoughts on a couple things, and we'd talk about it this week. So why don't we go to Scott and see what he wanted to say, but
I didn't have
held off.
I don't have any great prepared statements or anything. No, I mean, I was just kind of holding back from reacting to things and saying stuff because I felt like, gosh, I want to wait until we have more people here. We can really have, otherwise I'm just battling just a few of us. So anyway, that's all it really was. But with respect to this emphasis on Leontium and the beauty and all that stuff, I also have a vibe from, I've been talking vibe lately a lot, about, you think of Zeno and the public forum and the men that, just like always, they get up and they beat their chest, right? And they're big, strong. But here we have a very homey engagement between people. They're talking about things. They're discussing sexuality or sensuality, openly. And so it was a very different kind of a feeling there. And I think Epicureanism, of course, has that kind of real world feeling. It's not about me trying to be big and grand standing up on a stage. Yep. So, I mean, I also felt a little bit of that, which I don't know if that's kind of what you were saying also, Joshua. But anyway, on that regard.
Okay, well, I was thinking maybe you had some really, really challenging, profound commentary on virtue and pleasure.
We can go into, is there only one virtue, and start there, for instance. I mean, I think it was one of the more interesting questions for the chapter. We can begin with that because it kind of rolls into this greatest good conversation in some ways. We can, should we go there?
I think we probably should, but I'm trying to figure out exactly where the entry point should be.
I have a quote for you, Captain.
Okay.
Here's a quote from chapter 3.
Okay.
In the words of Epicurus, I think virtue only the highest pleasure, and vice or ungoverned passions and appetites the worst misery. Maybe that's a point of departure.
Yeah. I've not been very pleased at all with some of my formulations lately about, I know that nobody's really saying that virtue and pleasure are identical, but I have been struggling to figure out, are they hierarchically related? Is one a category that has the other one in it, or just exactly what is our current viewpoint of the relationship?
You're such a lawyer.
Well,
talk about Ciceronian.
Yeah. I'm very worried about being caught in a trap by Cicero or his team,
it's okay.
And in the end,
his bust sits right behind you.
Yes, exactly right. He's looking, frowning at me from the ages 2,000 years ago. It's interesting that particular bust, it really is a frown. He's looking downward and frowning as much as he can. So with Joshua, since you brought up the entry point, how do you interpret what that sentence that you just read? Is that accurate to Epicurus? And what do you think it means?
Well, I think we often say that there's probably not a lot of utility in talking about the highest pleasure. And because I often say, friendship, the greatest pleasure, but what the sources actually say is that friendship is an immortal pleasure, and there is no degree. I wonder if Don agrees with that, the way I put that.
And Joshua, the recording from this morning is not obviously done yet, but related to that, Don, would be the question we talked about briefly this morning: is friendship a virtue? It's certainly not one of the 4 or 5 classical, like courage, temperance, wisdom, and I don't know what the other one is, but
I don't think I would see it as a virtue. I think of virtues as being more individual, whereas friendship, by definition, there has to be 2 people in a friendship. But I think that, I mean, I could see duty to your friends being a virtue, but not friendship in and of itself.
Okay.
And I am literally just talking off the top of my head as I'm speaking. So
do I recall that one of the things that you came up with recently, Don, was that Epicurus calls prudence the greatest good?
Right. Right.
So prudence is a virtue, pretty clearly.
Correct.
Right?
Practical wisdom. Yeah.
Practical wisdom. Okay. So there's a section where he seems to say, or does say, that prudence is the greatest good.
Right. Right.
Which we then have to compare to some other statements about whether there's a greatest good and so forth or not.
I just want to posit that pleasure is, I don't know if it's kind of organic. It's natural. It's nature, and all these other things, virtues and goods. And I won't throw friendship into that, but virtues and goods are not. They're abstract. So they're two totally different categories. So the abstract category can lead you to pleasure, but if you're going to categorize pleasures, then that's a whole different thing than categorizing goods.
And I think that's why pleasure can be whenever you're comparing it to, virtue and wisdom and those sorts of things, I think that's why pleasure can be set apart as, the highest, the one at the summit, the one that's at the top, the thing, because I think it stands alone, because at least in Epicurus's reasoning, or at least in Epicurus's teaching, I should say, it's the highest good. It's the one that stands by itself, and everything else is an instrumental good towards that. And I think that's why you can say that, pleasure sort of sits at the top of the mountain and all the paths lead up to, virtue goes towards, the reason you practice virtue is because it is, leads to pleasure. The reason that you practice practical wisdom is that it leads to pleasure, and all that sort of thing. And that's why I think pleasure sort of has its own individual category as I hesitate to say abstract concept, but as a good. It's everything else leads that up to that.
Yeah.
Don, there's another quote in this chapter 3 that I think kind of gets to the heart of what you're saying, though. I don't quite like the way she phrased it, but she says, again, this is Epicurus speaking, virtue is pleasure. Were it not so, I should not follow it. I don't think that means that virtue is equivalent to pleasure.
Right.
But you follow virtue because that's a path to
exactly
the actual goal.
It goes back to the principal doctrine that you can't live virtuously, wisely, and nobly without living pleasantly, and vice versa. So it's the same sort of thing. It's everything is instrumental.
Right.
Yeah, I shared the screen to try to put that quote in front of us. At the very bottom of the screen before that, where they're talking about, is there more than one virtue, she specifically has him say, are they not the same? Virtue, is it not happiness, and is not happiness virtue? So she almost is there equating the two terms and trying to say that we should consider them to be the same.
And I think at least I would say that that's some sort of way to paraphrase that principal doctrine. Number
5.
Virtue, pleasure, virtue, wisdom, and nobility, make you live pleasurably. And if you live pleasurably, you have these. But it still seems to me that living pleasurably is the one that's like, that's the goal.
If we need a devil's advocate here, I would love to take after this just a little bit.
By all means, yeah.
Please.
Yeah. So I think pleasure itself is much of an abstract concept as anything else is. I think that putting it on top is, again, trying to put things in boxes, and they don't work for me. I think Epicurus would say, I'm not going to give you the definition of a cat, but damn it, if I see one, I know what it is. Okay. So, I think that's, we are trying very hard to put these words in a sort of not only hierarchical, but in some sort of relationship, putting one at the top and so forth. And there's cause for that, certainly. And Epicurus holds pleasure so highly, but to say that it's the highest thing, it doesn't, there's something wrong with putting it in that pedestal, because, for instance, you have to have wisdom along with pleasure. If you have only pleasure, you'll just sit there and pull the pleasure hammer all day long and just, you'll just drink the drink over and over. You have to have wisdom mixed with pleasure. Does that mean they're both equal? Yeah, that's not the right question. The right question is living well, is feeling good. And that feeling good is not just the word pleasure a lot of times seems so small, it just doesn't seem as big as I think what it is for Epicurus. Pleasure is a one-off. It's I do this and it gives me pleasure. But really the kind of pleasure we're talking about here is a bigger thing of many pleasures building up together and causing a feeling of meaningful and satisfying life, and not being dragged away by ridiculous ideas that are just too philosophical, where everybody is trying to put things in boxes and stuff, because that's not how human beings work. I don't know, there's an attempt to, I have a problem even with putting pleasure at the top, even though for Epicurus, you have to, but I'm like, sort of.
I think I know exactly. I think I know what you're saying too. That's one of the things that I try and wrestle with too. Is it pleasure, capital P, that we're talking about, or is it living a pleasurable life is what the goal is, as a whole? Because I think they're related, but they're different too. I'm not quite. We've had these discussions on the forum as well. Is pleasure and living a pleasurable life? Which one of those is actually the telos, the goal,
and again, I would say weighing those things starts to become the problem. So I have pleasures throughout my day. So I have daily life pleasures, this little pleasure, that little pleasure. That's really great. Having that is good. But if your life has no meaning, then those pleasures suck and your life sucks. On the other hand, if you really have a great sense of meaning in life and you know what you're going for, but your life is terrible on a day-to-day basis, that's a very different thing. Those are two different things, and you can't put one above the other. I think the truly pleasurable life is where you have good, plenty, as much as you can of both of those things, where your day-to-day life is well arranged so that you enjoy your living, but also you have a sense of, I know where I am in the world, I belong, and I feel good with all of my friends and my understanding of the world and so forth, and it's a satisfying life. When I die, I'm going to feel good about it. Those are, and I wouldn't want to try to say which one of those is better for him.
See, I always have, it always makes me uneasy whenever we start to talk about meaning and purpose and that sort of thing, because almost by definition, the universe does not have a purpose. The universe does not have a meaning. And whenever we start talking about, the meaning of life and that sort of thing, it's like, I always go back to the Monty Python film where at the very end, it was like, well, you want to know the meaning of life? It's like, well, drink a lot of water and, be nice to your friends. And, that's basically it. But so it always makes me uneasy whenever we start going down that meaning, the capital M meaning is I'm like,
I totally agree with you. And that sounds like I shouldn't. but I'm really right there with you, because meaning itself is something that comes out of our life, not that it's something abstract out there that we're going.
It's not something you aim for. It's something that sort of is composed. It's Does that make sense? The whole.
You're also guided to meaning by following pleasure. If you follow your faculty, if you follow your faculty of pleasure, that will eventually guide you to meaning. Because if you're doing one-off pleasures, you're not going to be satisfied, more than likely. And if you are satisfied, then that's your meaning. But if you're not, you're going to look for pleasure somewhere else using that faculty.
And I think that's one of the things too. I think meaning, if you start looking for meaning as something outside of yourself, and not that, that you're, I think Scott said it very well, that, your life is, you're together and you enjoy your friends, you enjoy your family, you do all that sort of thing. I mean, I think that sort of small m meaning is one thing. Whereas if you start looking for some sort of external meaning that you're trying to point towards, that's where I think you get into maybe some problems. And so the whole idea of pleasure being an internal feeling that you feel, the whole, to bring up another, kettle of fish with the whole, eudaimonia, that you have that indwelling, pleasant, good feeling inside of yourself, then that's what gives your life meaning. God, I can't even not use the word.
Yeah, and although Godfrey, I wonder about this. Can I really use pleasure only for my direction? Pleasure is always going to be there. It's always going to be directing me. I can't escape that. Nobody can. But is pleasure just all there is to it? Because there's so much talk, and justifiably, I think, to talk about using prudence and wisdom. That is a separate thing from pleasure. But if you don't have the two of them together, you don't end up with the most pleasurable life. Only following my pleasure? I don't know, it just sounds like a dog following their pleasure. They really don't know how to think more about, you really have a more pleasurable life. You could stop running into that, whatever. You know what I'm saying? It's just, I don't know.
Yeah, that's true. But the other thing is, pleasure is only half of the faculty. The other half is pain.
Mhm.
And that's really what the course correction, I think, is when you're doing stuff and you feel a pain on some level, then you use your prudence and reason.
Yes.
Mhm.
So it's,
Well,
yeah,
yeah, it goes back to the whole letter to Menoikeus too. That I mean, that pleasure is not an endless string of drinking parties and festivals. I mean, that feels good, and that that you can have some fun, but it is not an endless string of drinking parties. So doesn't mean you can't have one every once in a while, but just
yeah,
saying.
yeah. Eventually, you'll feel like your life has no meaning.
There's that word again. Oh, the M word.
That'll be the perceive that as pain. So it's almost like rather than, I mean, pleasure is the goal because it's the good thing that we're heading towards, and pain you head away from. But it's almost like if you come, and we've talked about this on the forum about, and Don, you've thrown out some stuff, suggested some stuff about like pathe or all the different words for the faculty, which we've never really come up with anything. But that seems like and all this again is separate. I don't want to use the word good because that's completely separate from good, which is all abstract stuff.
I will
So-
say I found it very interesting just recently now as I've been posting on the forum that the whole idea of tagathon as the as Epicurus's word and Philodemus's word for pleasure, as opposed to just agathos for good. Those there are many different goods, but there's only one tagathon, one the good, and then Epicurus specifically says that is pleasure. And I think Scott has a good point about that that wisdom and pleasure have to work together, but wisdom is always pointing towards pleasure. Pleasure is not pointing towards wisdom.
Right.
If that makes any sense.
The pleasure doesn't even know how to point towards wisdom. Yeah, I mean, it's
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Up with that.
Right. And that's why I always come back to those whole idea of the instrumental goods and you can have any number of things that help you get to, pleasure, even if it's you decide that your wisdom says, well, I'm going to do this painful thing right here because eventually I'm going to have more pleasure here in the future. That's where wisdom comes in to, sort of push you towards a pleasurable existence.
Again, going on this pleasure thing, I mean, somebody posted, I don't know whether it was Calasini or somebody posted about the different chemicals that are involved in the human body when we have sensations of pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something to think about. I think we might have glossed over that a little bit. Pleasure is not a single thing inside of a human being or inside of any mammal or being, probably. So these chemicals, some of the pleasures that are created by, serotonin, oxytocin, and all these others, they act differently. One of them is a kind of an exciter, pleasure feeling. Another is a very tranquil kind of pleasure feeling and a bonding and all these other kinds of things. Pleasure is more complicated even than it seems. Even that word itself is an abstraction, which we have to look out for. And if we can't nail down pleasure, because it is, after all, just a word in the English language, then what can we nail down? Well, I'm leaning towards there's something that's almost ineffable here that we have to try to capture, because that's what we want to go for. A pleasurable life is worthwhile. The things that nature gives us, what we're going for, but it's real hard to put that in words.
I haven't heard anything for a few minutes from Joshua.
Yeah, what I'm thinking about right now, I think it's from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where they've converted this planet into a giant ultra supercomputer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they've posed the question to the supercomputer, what is the meaning of life? And then it whirls and cogs and spins and all this for about 2,000 years, and then finally it spits out the number 42.
Yeah.
So I think there is a point at which language does become constrictive rather than constructive. And one thing that I think we need to maybe talk a little bit about here, because the word pathe has come up, I think of pleasure as being a feeling. And in Frances Wright's book, and this has come up on the forum, I know I at least have portrayed her as an empiricist. And this is partially, I guess this relates to that conversation, because what she says, I think in this chapter 3, is that we, pleasure and pain is something we sense rather than something we feel. She kind of sort of takes the feelings and the anticipation, perceptions, or whatever words you want to use to describe them, and throws them out and says sensation is the criteria, and it seems to be the only criteria. So maybe that's something to talk about. I don't know to do that today, but it's something to consider going.
Basically, you're saying the relationship between pleasure and pain and sensation?
Yeah.
Are they, yeah, or are
Because
they something added on to sensation, or are they, just what is the relationship?
because what's the key source here? And someone will be able to tell me when he says the feelings are two, pleasure and pain.
That is in Diogenes Laertius. I said today earlier for the Athens thing that it may be in the letter to Herodotus too, and I think there is something to that effect. But that stark statement that the feelings are two, I think, is Diogenes in the section where he's discussing.
Right. So anyway, that's where I'm thinking right now. I don't know. I certainly think that pleasure is the telos, the goal, the end toward which we direct all our efforts, and that all of these other things like prudence and wisdom are maybe necessary to get the best effect out of pursuing that end, but it doesn't change what the end is. And the other thing I find interesting is that we talk about putting pleasure on a pedestal. Ironically, Frances Wright describes it in exactly the opposite. She said that virtue is on a pedestal, and that nobody stoops to examine the ground on which virtue stands. Pleasure. So pleasure is the foundation of the pursuit of all these.
Joshua, I'm back. I guess I'm sharing my slide, but at any rate, so have we? One of the quotes out of her, and maybe it's right near the end of. It's either near the end of chapter 3 or it's right before they move on from this discussion to the painting issue. But the sort of way that Epicurus confronts Theon with it is that the quote that I've got there is that with evil passions I'd be disturbed and uneasy, with uncontrolled appetites I'd be disordered in body as well as mind, and for this reason and for this reason only I avoid both. And Theon responds only because he's into the Stoic mode of virtue. But then there's that last sentence that she puts in Epicurus's mouth that you quoted earlier, Joshua. Only virtue is pleasure. Were it not so, I would not follow. Are we okay that is an accurate statement of Epicurean philosophy? That
maybe it's her way of paraphrasing. Maybe virtue is pleasurable. Were it not so, I should not follow it. Is that what she's saying?
Well, that's clearly what I'm thinking, Don, is what you've just said, is that virtue is pleasurable. But she's really, I really have to give it to her for this book. It's very precise and she's very smart. And she is, I doubt she changed the verb form sloppily, or that I have a feeling she's intentionally making this point. And I don't know whether I agree that that's a good summary of it or not, because when you say something is something else, like I say, I go back into that narrow-minded lawyer talk of, if you say something is something else, then you're saying they're the same. And I don't really generally think of virtue and pleasure as the same.
Yeah, if that's what she's saying, I wouldn't agree with her. I mean, I could agree with virtue is pleasurable. Were it not so, I should not follow it. Because again, that gets at the instrumental nature of virtue.
Right. So I would vote with you. I mean, not that we're going to have a vote, but Don, I would agree with you.
Let's have a vote. What the hell?
Yeah, I would agree with you that it would have been better if she had said virtue is pleasurable. Would anybody want to support the way it's written there now, Joshua? Do you think that she really meant to say virtue is pleasure and that we should look at it that way?
Well, it's complicated because when you look at these other quotes, she says, I feel myself virtuous because my soul is at rest. There's quite a lot of talk about virtue in this book. You own then, this is Theon speaking, you own then no pleasure but virtue and no misery but vice. But then Epicurus replies, not at all. I think virtue own the highest pleasure.
But that kind of implies the same thing, that virtue is a pleasure. Virtue.
It does. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm not prepared to say that I quite agree with that. I think that would be a category error.
That's a good way to put it.
That would be putting things in wrong boxes.
But or just poetic license and really kind of just throwing these things around a little bit more loosely. I don't know that she really would exactly. I wouldn't think she's really exactly, for instance, equating virtue and pleasure. I just can't imagine that she's really saying those are the same box. Sort of. Yeah. Maybe it's just being creative about the way she's saying it, but I mean, I don't know what the heck she's thinking, but
There's
Right.
also the problem too of the 18th century prose style that she is, of course, is writing in as well. I mean, there's maybe something that we are missing just because of the sheer centuries that have passed since she was writing too.
Well, I definitely think it would be a mistake to consider her and what she writes to be. I mean, she's obviously not in touch with the ancient Epicureans and doesn't have the ability to claim more intelligence about them than we do. But I do give her a lot of credit for thinking through a lot of things that I have only begun to think through myself and taking a firm position on them. So it's
you said she was like what, 18 or something when she wrote this thing or something like that,
or 20 or so, something very, very young.
There's a line showing now, you own then no virtue but pleasure and no misery but vice. So that's reinforcing what she said in that other line, which we're disagreeing with. At least as I read it.
But as Joshua pointed out, she has Epicurus disagree with that, but not really in the sense of equating. It's not his disagreement is not exactly a clear disagreement on what we're talking about, because it implies that she is saying that virtue is a pleasure, but she's saying virtue is the highest pleasure instead of a pleasure.
And who said the long paragraph there at the beginning on the screen that you have up?
That would be
the masters who would then.
I'm pretty sure that's Epicurus himself in her. It's not Leontium or anybody else. That's Epicurus.
Okay. So he's the one who says the masters who would have us follow virtue for her own sake. That's Epicurus. Okay.
And so all that discussion about the senses being everything we've got to judge things with, I mean, I think that's very well founded in Epicurean text. So maybe you take that information, and maybe if you think through that long enough, you come back to that conclusion that that virtue is a pleasure and vice is.
What about this, Cassius? I mean, the word virtue has changed, over time, and of course it's translated too. But I know
changed as dramatically as your backdrop has. I haven't noticed that you moved there.
My wife is setting the dinner table here, so I had to move over here. But yeah, I mean, virtue, I mean, in maybe in the 1800s was not just, and perhaps even in the Roman times, was not just a moral ideal, but it was also, and I think for in Stoicism, I've read this, that it was something that behooves, it's something that goes with the characteristic that belongs to something. Like a horse had speed as a virtue. Okay, it wasn't the horse had any moral, ethical goodness or anything, but it was just proper for that horse to have speed if it was a racehorse and so forth. So, in that sense, you could have virtue being looked at differently here, because virtue and pleasure could be the same. If one knows how to live pleasurably and one does that well, that could be virtuous in a sense. They could be kind of identified the same, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's also an etymological connection between the word virtue and the Roman word for man, the Latin word for man.
Virtue.
So yeah, I do agree. It's kind of a complicated issue. Don brought that up, the problem of language changing over time. It's interesting to see that the reason has undergone some changes. There are times in history when the word is almost used more like logos almost, rather than being like a process for figuring stuff out. It's like this transcendental law that everything.
Yeah, that whole idea of language and everything. I think I always, or I shouldn't say always, but I often find myself coming back to that Sedley translation of Epicurus's On Nature, book 28, where language is, the whole topic of the conversation, and talking about, that he's, trying to go for the most basic definition. Whenever you use a word, you should know what it means, and you shouldn't have to argue about it and all that sort of stuff. And I think that's one of the things in this conversation that we've had about highest good and this, that, and the other thing, that there has to be some sort of basic definition or basic meaning that comes across whenever you say these things, and instead of trying to build all the fancy philosophical superstructure around it and stuff. So I'm trying to wrestle with that myself, but I find that Sedley translation very, very interesting.
we'll probably wrap up before too much longer too. But let me say this, I guess, being the diplomat and the peacemaker that I always try to be, never spurring people to unnecessary argument. One thing I would say firmly would be that any differences that we're probably stating among ourselves about how to apply these words, those differences pale in comparison to when you compare Epicurus to the Stoics, or basically to any other group. This, I mean, whatever this relationship is between virtue and pleasure, virtue is not given to us by the gods out of the 10 commandments or something handed down from heaven. Amen, amen. And it's not part of Plato's ideal forms that exist in some other dimension that we can get to only through reasoning and mathematics and elaborate abstract reasoning. And it's probably not also, I'm less confident in characterizing Aristotle's viewpoint, but I keep hearing the word essences used in describing him. So I don't think that there is an essence of virtue that is contained within certain actions or certain people or anything like that. So we can throw all of those standard Greek interpretations of virtue out of the window and still be, even if we have disagreements about how you relate the words virtue and pleasure, none of those options that the other Greeks had suggested are anywhere near considered. So.
And I guess too, I was talking about the principal doctrine earlier, and I think I was using live virtuously, but the actual word that he uses is justly, isn't it? It's
or honorably, is it? I forget.
I think
it's wisely, honorably, and just.
So dikaios, kalos, and what was the other one? Can't remember what
I
the
don't
three.
know, Don. It's Greek to me.
Me too. That's it. But I do think I think, as we get into all these detailed discussions, it could be a turnoff to some people. I do think that the big picture is the difference between Epicurus as this all being a natural situation that we're just struggling to describe versus it being something that's handed down by God or something exists out in some kind of an undefinable abstract layer of, that whole cave analogy. There's nobody dangling shadows in front of us. That's just not the discussion. Whatever virtue and pleasure are, we can figure it out the way we define terms, and we're going to end up very much apart.
Yeah, there was a time where I thought the whole Plato's cave was just so profound and all that sort of thing. And now I'm looking at it and I was like, man, that's just.
I think it says a whole lot more about Plato than it says about the truth of the universe.
Yeah.
Because it probably does give us a glimpse into the Plato manipulation of people and that kind of a noble
or just his disregard for the day-to-day life as it's really lived, that it's like, well, this isn't important. What's really important is the realm of forms and all this sort of thing. And so it's a real denigration of like everyday life and that sort of thing from what I can see now.
Absolutely.
Have you seen the T-shirts of Plato's Cave Rescue Team? Is that the?
No, I have not.
Yeah, I've considered getting one myself, but I was like,
you'll have to give us the link because I don't know what you're talking about. Joshua, did anybody know what he's talking about?
I don't, but I'm immediately amused by the
yeah.
That's one of those philosopher T-shirt companies that are out there. It's one of the Plato's Cave Rescue Team.
Okay. Is there a picture that goes along with it, or is it just the slogan itself?
I think it's the slogan. I think there's some sort of rescue sort of like equipment or something on it or something like that, like repelling equipment.
Okay. Well, we've gone longer than an hour, obviously, but I think we've spent a lot of time earlier in general discussion that I will not include in the recap that we memorialized for eternity in audio somewhere. But this last part of this discussion has been I was hoping for last week. We just didn't have enough to do it out loud. So we can, I think at this point, we definitely next week to chapter 4 and talk about the Cynics and Gryphon and that whole episode. So that's what next. But this, of course, is our 20th celebration as well. So I think the combination of us talking at the beginning and then having this discussion at the end is pretty much my view of the ideal activity for of course, I would never want to just like eat or drink or anything like that, like normal people would. We would just have to continue our debating. That's what we're missing in not being together, the ability to do this over table and so forth. Maybe one day. Next year in Samos or whatever. What is it? Next year in Jerusalem is what they all say, right? Next year in Athens, Greece.
All right.
Right.
Good night,
Thank you.
everybody.
Have a good night, everybody.
Okay.
Bye bye.